We are recording the interview of Army veteran Tom Hardy. This interview is being conducted by Jeremy Tack and Eric Rude from the Wright State University's Veteran Voices Project. This interview is being recorded at Wright State University in the New Media Incubator. It is 2:20 p.m. on December 1st, 2017. Dr. Hardy, thank you for being here. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
So let's get started with where and when were you born?
I was born November 10th, 1944 in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania.
Who were your parents and what were their occupations?
My father was James Thomas Hardy. He was a Navy veteran, World War II, and he was a salesman for a company called Diversey. They're still around today. They make chemicals for farm and dairy use. Mm-hmm. My mother was Avis McCarter Hardy. She was a school teacher.
Do you have any siblings?
I have a brother, John Hardy, who still lives in Pennsylvania, and a sister, Catherine, who lives in Florida.
Do you have any other family members that were served in the military?
Not immediate family members. My wife went to the United States Military Academy at West Point, one of the first classes of women to go through there. And we've had a number of nephews and cousins who have also gone there. I have a nephew there now who's a junior at West Point.
Okay. So before you joined the Army, what did you do?
I grew up on a farm. My mother and father went to Gettysburg College. I tell people that I was a legacy. They had to take me there, you know. It was the only place I applied to go to college. And when they graduated, they bought my grandparents' summer home, which was a farm right outside of Gettysburg, about 15 miles outside of Gettysburg. And that's where I grew up for 18 years. Mm-hmm. And then went back to Gettysburg College.
Mm-hmm. So at Gettysburg College, what did you study?
I didn't study much of anything, frankly. I went there to play football.
Mm-hmm.
I had a football scholarship, and I was a lousy student. I barely graduated because by the time my senior year rolled around, I knew I was going to go to Vietnam, mm-hmm. and I knew I had a commission as an infantry officer. And in those days, that wasn't a profession where you made long-term plans. Mm-hmm. So I graduated with a 2.3 GPA. Uh-huh. And it's not something I'm particularly proud of, and I'm lucky today to be a physician because I came back and I recovered, mm-hmm. and went back to school, got my grades up, and ultimately got into medical school.
Mm-hmm. So did you do ROTC?
I did ROTC. When I went there, you had to take either physical education, mm-hmm. And I was already playing football, and I knew I didn't want to go down to the gym 2 more days a week, you know, to play kickball, or this thing called ROTC. And I got to the end of the line, and I asked this guy, today I realize it's an E7, mm-hmm. what is this ROTC thing? And he said, son, sit down here. And he signed me up for it, and I enjoyed it. I mean, mm-hmm. I really liked those first 2 years, and then at the end of the second year, if you've done well, they give you an option of signing on the dotted line, mm-hmm. to, you know, go on to actually commit to a commission, essentially. Mm-hmm. And I did that, not really knowing what I was getting myself into. Mm-hmm. This would have been the fall of 1964, and really no one had heard of Vietnam then. Mm-hmm. And certainly a year or two later, everybody knew where it was. But I didn't really quite understand what I was getting myself into with this. Worked out all right, mm-hmm. in the end.
What did you think about the Army? Were you particularly pleased with that at the time, or did you think, man, what about some of the other branches?
Well, the Marine Corps has something called the Platoon Leaders Course, mm-hmm. which you can still sign up for, I think, today. It's 2 summers, I think, at either Quantico or Paris Island, where you go through the officer basic course. And I initially had signed up for that. And I came home Thanksgiving my freshman year, and sitting around the dinner table with my grandparents and my mother and buddy, I announced that I had, you know, I was going to join this Platoon Leaders Course, and I was going to become a Marine officer. And there was this hush around the table. I'll never forget it. And my grandmother, who never said anything, said, I don't think that's a very good idea. And afterwards, my grandfather came down to Gettysburg College, and he took me into the chapel. And they have a big bronze plaque on the wall, and he showed me all these friends of my mother and father who had been Marine officers who had been killed in, mm-hmm. World War II. And he said, for your grandmother's sake, I don't want you to do that. So I continued with my ROTC then and ended up, being an Army Ranger and spending 18 months in combat in Vietnam. So probably lucky I wasn't a Marine though, because actually being a Marine lieutenant in Vietnam was much more lethal than what I did.
So what kind of training did you do as an ROTC student?
It's funny, every Tuesday afternoon you put on this old green, ill-fitting uniform and marched around on the quadrangle while everybody hung out the windows of the dorm hooting at you. And that's really much about what you did for those first 2 years. I think we had a weekend a year where we went to Indiantown Gap Military Reservation and ran around the woods and fired blanks and those kinds of things. The first 2 years were pretty benign. It was mostly classroom work, history of the Army, which I loved, and it didn't involve a lot of time. It just Tuesday afternoon, you go up there and march around, and it wasn't until my junior year that things really got serious.
What happened junior year?
Well, you go to summer camp between your junior and senior year, and that's where I had my first real taste of the Army. Living in old World War II barracks, which I don't know if you've ever seen those, but they're wooden 2-story buildings. They must have built 1 million of them. And 50 years after World War II, some of them are still around. They're full of asbestos and other things, but it didn't seem to bother people at the time. And we lived in those World War II barracks, and I really liked that. It wasn't hard. The physical part of it for me was easy because I played football, and nothing I ever did in the Army bothered me physically. Ranger school, airborne school, Vietnam, none of those things were ever hard for me physically. I'm just blessed that those kind of things come easily.
Do you have any instructors that stood out to you during those times?
I had a big brother in my fraternity who preceded me by 2 years, and my career path in the Army mirrored his almost exactly. He went to the 101st Airborne Division, so when I had a choice of units, I picked the 101st. He was a jump master, I was a jump master. He went to Ranger School, I went to Ranger School. He ended up being an advisor in Vietnam, and so was I. Vance Forpaw, he's a great guy. He ended up being an instructor at West Point, even though he was an ROTC guy, which is unusual. And today he is a buffalo rancher in Colorado. He's got 10,000 acres of nothing up there, with a lot of buffalo running around on it.
So you eventually made it through college and then the training and the commissioning. What did that feel like when you finally got your commission?
June 6, 1966, I went and got commissioned. And I was so hungover, I thought I was going to die, along with all the other guys in there getting commissioned. In the chapel, no air conditioning, must have been 100 degrees. My mother came down and pinned those little gold bars on me. It was a big deal, to be something, to be, growing up on a farm and going to a little school and not being very distinguished either athletically or academically, to be an officer was a really big deal. And then the next day, so that was a Sunday, the next day, Monday, I left for the Army. I left for Fort Campbell, 7 o'clock the next morning. I drove from Camp Hill, Pennsylvania to Fort Campbell, Kentucky. I'd never been that far away from home in my life. And there was no interstate, in those days, and I had no money. I think I might have had $50 to make the trip, no credit card, the things that we take so much for granted today. It was like an adventure going down there. And Vance Forpaw, my big brother who had preceded me, said, look, have a uniform in your car, and when you get close to Fort Campbell, stop at a gas station and change into your uniform. Don't drive in it for 2 days and look like, a rag doll, I said. So make sure everything is squared away. So I did. I went, I got in my uniform with my little lieutenant's bars on there, and I drove up to the front gate, and all I had were my orders to get. So I gave this military policeman my orders, and he snapped to attention and said, "Airborne, sir!" And I about fell out of the car, and I said, wow. And they take you to division headquarters and then down to brigade headquarters and then, down to the battalion. So I was in the 2nd Battalion Airborne 501st Infantry, Geronimo. They had a big Indian, like a cigar store Indian in the battalion headquarters. And I reported to the battalion commander, and it was a man named John P. Gerasi, whose call sign on the radio was Mal Hombre. And he was a Mal Hombre. And I'm in my little Class A ROTC uniform with nothing on it. I didn't have a medal on it. I think I might have had my name tag. And the adjutant said, okay, you go and stop 3 feet in front of his desk. You salute and say, "Sir, Lieutenant Hardy reporting for duty." So I did just that. I saluted and nothing happened. And then all of a sudden he looked up and he saluted and he looked around at the adjutant and he said, "Where did you get this leg?" Which is a non-airborne guy. And he said, "Hardy, give me 25 push-ups." And I'm in my Class A uniform. So I got down, I gave 25, I got back up again. He said, "Get out of here and don't come back until you're a paratrooper. You understand?" I said, "Yes, sir." And I left and went out into the lobby, and there were all the battalion staff officers gathered around to meet me. It was kind of a rite of passage, that you go through. But it shook me. And so they pointed me toward Fort Benning, and a week after I graduated from Gettysburg College, I was standing in this formation at Fort Benning with 1,000 guys. 1 week after I got out of college, standing there, I was clueless about what was going on. And this little airborne sergeant came up and looked at me one morning, and he said, "Big Lieutenant, you got nose hairs." And I'm standing there, I looked down at him, I smiled, which is a big mistake. So I did a lot of push-ups for those 3 weeks, learning about the Army. But it was an experience, And by the time, a month after I graduated from college, I had my jump wings. And most of my fraternity brothers were still getting drunk down in Ocean City and running around, and it was an epiphany. It was a life-changing, one of many life-changing events I had in the Army. I mean, it really made me grow up. Jumping out of that airplane and surviving, and then as soon as I got back to Fort Campbell, I noticed my name on the board to go to the Advanced Airborne Course, which is a Jumpmaster course. So I, in 2 weeks, learned how to rig loads and get them out of an aircraft and get, all, like, you imagine 80 guys like you. I mean, you were much more well-educated than the paratroopers I had. 80 of those guys in a plane, and get them rigged up and get them out safely, get them on the ground. You sign for all the parachutes. Okay, so I was signed for 80 parachutes. And you would think it would be hard for someone to leave something that big behind. Not at all, particularly at night. Okay, so there was a lot of growing up in that first year, and then in December, I think my company commander called me in and asked me if I wanted to go to Ranger School. I said sure. So they sent me back to Fort Benning in January, and I'm a winter ranger, which is, there's this distinction between guys that go through in the winter. They sew their ranger tab on with white thread or something, and guys that go through in the summer. And so exactly a year after I got out of college, I went back. I hadn't been home for a year. I went back to the graduation for the class that was behind me because I had a lot of friends in the class, and people didn't recognize me. I mean, it was like I'd been transformed into somebody new. I didn't feel it or realize it as much myself as other people did, particularly my mother. Just looked at me and just was in disbelief that this guy who had been sort of bumping along through life for 21 years came back and was squared away. So it was a life-changing event.
So I'm curious, what's the feeling like the first time you jump out of an airplane?
The first time is not bad because you don't know what's happening. We had these old C-119 and the 119 flying boxcars. They have them over at Wright Pat in the museum, like everything else associated with my life. And they're rickety. They bounce around, they rattle around, and there were a lot of guys on there that had never flown before. It was the first flight they'd ever made in their life. And a friend of mine named Bill Ayers was sitting across from me. He was a country boy from down south, and his eyes are about this big around. And you get up, you hook up, you're in a line of people. I think there were 20 on a stick on each side. And all of a sudden, it starts moving, like toward the door. And there's a guy behind you pushing. And all of a sudden, you're in the door, and you're out, you're gone. And It's the second time that's scary, you know, and the third, the fourth, and the fifth time, which is why when I got back to Fort Campbell and I saw my name up there to do this again, I was like, oh my God. But 2 weeks of Jump Master School gets you over all that. You know, it's just a job. You're up there, you realize your responsibility, you realize what can happen if you screw up. You know, you've got the lives, literally the lives of 80 guys in your hands. And for someone who just got out of college, that was a moment when I realized that this wasn't, you didn't get a second chance if something bad happened up there, and you'd be responsible for it. So, yeah, the first time is scary, but after that it really becomes just a job. And actually it can be a lot of fun to do it.
During all this training, was there any instructors that stood out to you?
Well, probably that NCO down at jump school who took me on as a project. I had the same belt buckle that I'd had in ROTC. So I had 4 years of Brasso inside. I don't know if they still use Brasso, you know, if it's gone by the wayside, but back in the day everything had to be Brassoed. And so he looked at my belt buckle one day and he said, "What are you growing in there, big lieutenant?" And of course, I looked down and he goes, "Don't you eyeball me," so more push-ups. And that night, this guy named Jack Fickerson, who was a lieutenant with me there, took me aside. He'd gone to Texas A&M. He knew how to do all this kind of stuff. And he took my buckle apart, showed me how to do it. We cleaned everything on the inside. And he made me go buy another pair of boots. And so I had 2 pairs of boots. And every day after jump school, we'd take the boots down to this place and they'd shine them for you. So I didn't have to do that. So the next day, this little NCO came by and he looked at me, he looked at my boots, he looked at my belt buckle and he said, "You found a friend." And I smiled. And so more push-ups, you know, down to the ground again. Yeah, I wasn't a real quick learner. But, you know, I've been helped a lot along the way, like a lot of people, by folks that, you know, probably have taken pity on me for one reason or another.
So after all this training, jump school, jump master school, and then ranger school, how long did that all take, by the way? That was...
I went through about 16 months of training before I went to Vietnam. I mean, I was very fortunate. I was about as well trained as you could make a 22-year-old guy before he sent into the war. You know, because I had been on tons of exercises with 101st. I was a platoon leader, and then I got to be, you know, like the assistant S4, and I had to move food and water and all that kind of stuff around, and learned how to do that. And so for a guy going to combat, I was about as well trained as you could be. And then the Army sent me to the Special Warfare School at Fort Bragg because I was going to be an advisor. And you know, learned to speak Vietnamese, and learned about the history of the war. So I knew a lot more about the war when I went there than any American in an American unit. Most of them couldn't find it on the map. You know, they would just get on a plane, and the next thing they'd wake up in a foreign, you know, in a foreign country.
What was the feeling like when you got orders to go to Vietnam?
Oh my God! I told you I went on leave to go home for that graduation at the end of the first year. And I came back to my unit I was then in this supply section as the assistant S4, and the supply sergeant came up to me and he said, "Lieutenant Hardy, what size toe tag you wear?" I said, "Toe tag?" He goes, "Yeah, you know what toe tag's for, right?" And I said, "Yeah." I said, "Why?" He says, "Here are your orders to Vietnam." And I can remember this pit in my stomach, just this overwhelming feeling of fear. It's really hard to describe. Up to that point, it was sort of fun and games. That it wasn't real. You know, all this stuff was just pretend. You know, using blanks and chasing people through the woods and stuff. But what was really troubling is that I said, "I have orders to Vietnam. I'm going over with you guys." He goes, "No, you're not." He says, "Look at your orders." And it said, "Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, from General Westmoreland. Dear Lieutenant Hardy, welcome to the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam. You've been selected, blah, 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 blah." So I was not going over with this unit. I wasn't going over as a platoon leader. I wasn't going over as an XO. I wasn't going over with this unit that I knew would take care of me, where I knew everybody, where all the officers were squared away. Most of the NCOs had already been to Vietnam, one tour, you know, where I knew if we got into combat that someone would be taking care of me. I was going over to be an advisor, and there were stories of the Vietnamese units running away from their advisors in combat, just leaving them out there, you know. And it really terrified me. And I tried everything I could to get out of this. I went to see the company commander, the battalion commander, the brigade commander, and finally the brigade commander said, Tom, you know, you have to do what the Army wants you to do. And they had come down and levied the division for about half a dozen airborne Ranger qualified lieutenants, you know, to kind of stiffen the backbone of the Vietnamese Army. So thinking of it in that way, it was a good idea. Thinking of it from my perspective, it was a really bad idea, because you were going to be out there with on a 5-man team, you know, captain, lieutenant, 2 NCOs, and a radio operator in the middle of nowhere with people whose language you didn't speak very well, whose fighting abilities, at least I thought then, were suspect because of all the stories, you know, that you'd heard about them. And it turns out that that probably saved my life, because the 2nd of the 501st Infantry lost 45 of its 47 officers, killed or wounded, in the first year they were in Vietnam. Almost everybody, all those people that I had been with, got killed or wounded in that first year. It was unbelievable. When I think about it today, about my luck, my life has just been one lucky event after another. And that moment, you know, getting sent to MACV instead of going over with them was just one of those moments. I would be on that wall in Washington just as sure as shooting. So it was, you know, one of those, I think about it, and I actually never have thought much about this. Vietnam was like a story somebody told me, and the longer it's been since Vietnam, the less I thought about it, until I started working at the VA. I had put this away. A moment like this, talking about this, I never would have thought about it in a million years. It was, you know, birth of my children, it was just one of those things. It wasn't, and it isn't today a big thing. It's just one of those experiences that men go through. And I was fortunate to have gone through it and survived. And I realize that more now than perhaps I realized it in the intervening years. That now when I think about it, talking to you or just sitting in the VA and talking to some of those old guys, I remember things. I was like, oh my gosh. I didn't think about it being lucky at the time. At the time, I just thought, I didn't think anything about it. You know, no matter how close the call was or what happened, I didn't give it a thought, because I had a job to do, you know, as an officer. I had other people to worry about, you know, not myself. But I think about it now, it's like, whoa, baby, you know?
So tell me what the experience was like when you first got into country in Vietnam.
You know, particularly at Christmas time, because my mother took me down to Philadelphia to the airport with my brother and sister, and it was like they were 3rd or 4th or 5th grade, you know, they were really young. And it was like I was going on vacation, because they were telling me what they wanted me to bring back, you know, like souvenirs, you know, a doll baby, who knows what, a truck. And I didn't know what I was getting myself into. And I drove down the turnpike, we got to Philadelphia, and when I went to get on the plane, they called, you know, the place was full of uniforms. It was like an old movie, you know, from World War II, and you see all these uniforms around. And the war hadn't become terribly unpopular, you know, then. It did later. Next couple of years, things fell apart. But
what year was this?
This would have been 26th of December, 1967.
Okay.
I mean, Kent State hadn't happened. We hadn't had all those issues. And I turned around to get on the plane. My mother was crying. And I can't remember ever seeing her cry. And I said, hey, I'm going to be all right. She just she would not be consoled, you know? And I couldn't understand it at the time. And it wasn't until years later I realized what it must have been like for my mother to sit at home every night and watch TV with her big dumb son over there, you know, and she didn't really know what I was doing. And I wrote 2 letters one day, one to my brother and one to my mother. And I had some pictures that I had put in this envelope of a night attack. And this was, you know, just the North Vietnamese soldiers. We had bodies. You could walk from one to another, you know, across the battlefield. And I put them in this letter, and I got the letters switched. So I sent my brother's letter to my mother with the pictures, and my mother's letter to my brother. And he didn't tell me that for years later. And he said, you know, I remember one time I got this letter that was written, you wrote it to Mom, and it was in my envelope. And he says, no, I noticed she came up and gave me the letter and had these awful pictures in it. And I was like, oh my God. Because I've been telling her, you know, I was safe and, you know, not to worry, everything was all right, you know, I wasn't in any danger, blah, 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 blah. So I'm sure that didn't go a long way to making her, you know, feel comfortable about it. But just the day-to-day waiting for the knock on the door, waiting to see those 2 guys in uniform standing in the driveway, and how awful that must have been. Because, you know, people were having sons and husbands die, you know, all over the place in the neighborhood. And, you know, there were funerals, you know, going on, and to have her go through that. And she never said a word about it when I got back. And I was clueless about what she had gone through. But I appreciate it a lot more today. And I appreciate a lot more today what the families of veterans, you know, go through. If you look at what Lincoln said about the VA, it says to care for him who has borne the battle and his widow and children. You know, we don't do a lot of that at the VA in terms of the widow and children thing, but we're sensitive to family members out there. And I think thinking about my mom has made me much more appreciative of what the parents of folks go through.
You arrived at a special time in the war. Talk about that.
You know, when you get off the plane, there's some movies. Born on the 4th of July is a good movie because there's a great scene when they come in to the airport. And there's this huge Quonset hut that you could put like 1,000 guys in. And there are 500 guys sitting on this side of the aisle, and then there are 500 empty chairs. And as you come in there, these guys are all hollering at you, hey, Charlie's out there, he got your number, big lieutenant. You know, as I'd be stumbling along and say, what's your girlfriend's phone number? I'll take care of it when I get back. I'm just this harassment from these wild-looking, hairy, you know, crazy-looking people over there. They were all in uniform, but they looked like they were going to a costume party. You know, a lot of them were just, they were berserk. And so you'd all come in with your little overnight bag and your clean uniform and sit down, and they'd all get on the plane, and half of them were drunk, and it was just a mess. And I thought, man, this is what I'm going to look like, you know, when I get there, you know, a year from now. And we get assigned to our units. There's a big map of Vietnam on the wall. So you come in the room, and they each gave you a piece of paper, and there's a numbered, like a pin up there, and you go out and find out where you're supposed to go. So I come out, and my unit is right on the Cambodian border. I didn't know much about it, but it didn't seem like a good place for me at the time. And the guy that I went over with, Dick Glenn, we'd been in the same unit back at Fort Campbell together. We were platoon leaders in the same rifle company, he and I. So we'd known each other for almost 18 months. And he's looking, he can't find his, and he looks down by Saigon. There's a little town called Ben Hoa, which is where the airport was. He says, Hardy, he goes, look at this. And there's his pin right there in the middle of the city, you know? And he goes, you can come stay at my villa sometime if you want to. He was dead 6 weeks later. Tet hit. 6 weeks later, he was dead. You know? So it's another one of those moments, you know, when things happen in your life and you don't realize if it's a good thing or, you know, or a bad thing. But, you know, I got out with this Vietnamese unit, and they were pretty sorry, I must say. But it wasn't their fault. It was that they were using World War II equipment. They were using M1 carbines, M1s, BARs. I mean, the Browning automatic rifle thing's been around since the First World War. They had no logistics. They had no medical supply. They didn't have a medic with a unit. No medic. What happens if you get wounded? You know? One of the members of the advisory team was always a medic. So the 5-man team had, you know, 2 officers, a weapons guy, a medic, and a radio operator. That was the team. And so our doc was the doc, you know, for everybody out there. And without him, they would have struggled. And when the Americans fault the Vietnamese for not being aggressive, you know, in combat, you know, for not getting online and sweeping across an open rice paddy against fortified positions, which we did a lot. Part of the reason was there's no VA in Vietnam for those guys if they get wounded. You know, there's no disability, there's no Social Security, there's really not a hospital. There's nobody who's going to give you a prosthetic leg. There's none of, they had none of that stuff. And so there was this asymmetry between the fighting forces over there. The Americans that had everything you could ever want, enough firepower to blow this university off the map, and then this Vietnamese unit, which had really only been constituted about 15 years before. There wasn't a Vietnamese army. The Americans stood this thing up from nothing. And so they weren't equivalent forces. And they never were going to be able to defeat the North Vietnamese, who had had years to perfect this and had a tremendous relationship with Russia and China, with advisors and, you know, guys like me, but you know, guys that stayed with them, you know, not a year there and a year back. So it was a real learning experience to see how they operated. You know, they had old cast-off helmets and old cast-off uniforms and old cast-off boots and old cast-off weapons, and so that was the unit I joined. I mean, you know, to make them a credible fighting force. Interesting experience.
Can you tell me the mission or the responsibilities of an advisor there in Vietnam?
Every advisor, every officer was assigned what was called a counterpart. So I had a lieutenant that was the person I was assigned to. That was my battle buddy, essentially. And he looked a lot older than me. And he said to me, he spoke English. He said, "How old are you?" I said, "I'm 22. I just turned 23. He said, "You're my advisor." I said, "Yes." He says, "I've been fighting longer than you've been alive. What kind of advice are you going to give me, Lieutenant?" And I got the message. I don't know what kind of people he'd had before, but I realized that I had stepped into something that I was going to have to work my way through. And I said something that I've used a lot in my life. I said, "Well, I'm going to wait for you to ask me for something. I don't know what I can give you, but if you need something that I can produce, then I'll do it." And he said, "I need 10,000 sandbags." I said, "Okay." Remember, I'd been an assistant S4. I knew how to do that kind of stuff. And so I managed to wrangle 10,000 sandbags from the American unit that was about 10 miles away. And that settled my my first week with him, you know. He had an advisor that could actually do something. But we're in a little dirt fort, you know, triangular fort. If you imagine the Dragon Stadium downtown as a triangle, that's about how big it was. You know, it had an entrance on it. On each point was a fortified area, you know, with a M60. Had a mortar pit in the middle. Then the walls of the triangle were bunkers that the Vietnamese soldiers lived in. And there was a little hut for the Americans that we lived in, and then a little house, really, for the Vietnamese officer, you know, to live in there. And the first outpost I was in didn't have, you know, it had an outhouse that you had to kind of go out through the barbed wire, you know, to get to. And I asked the team sergeant, what do you do if you want to take a bath or a shower or something around here? He says, well, there's a well over there, and it was concrete with a rim around the top so water wouldn't run down in it. He says, just get a bucket and throw it down there and wash yourself off. That seems simple enough. So I go out there, I got a towel, I got my kit and everything, and the Vietnamese had their families in this outpost, I mean, it wasn't just soldiers.
Mm-hmm.
And so I throw the bucket down in there, I have a towel wrapped around me, I take the towel off, I drop it down, I put this water on, I wash up, I put the bucket down in there, I rinse everything off, and when I opened my eyes, the entire outpost of Vietnamese was gathered around looking at me, laughing. And I had no clue that this is, I'm standing there stark naked, this 6'4" American, and they were all hooting and hollering, pointing at my wiener and just doing all sorts of stuff. And my NCO came up and said, Lieutenant, because when we do this, we usually wear like a little bathing suit or something on here. I go, ooh, okay. So I put the towel on and went back, and I don't know if I had a bathing suit or shorts. I don't know what I did anymore, but I'll never forget opening my eyes and seeing half the Vietnamese army around, looking at me. And it was just one of those cultural encounters that made being an advisor such a memorable experience.
Mm-hmm. What did you do for fun while you were in Vietnam?
Nothing.
Nothing. What about?
Actually, that's not true. Depending on what outpost we were in, if we weren't in the middle of nowhere, if we were in an outpost that was near a town or right in a town or village, at night they would have a little tin hut, a little hut that, if you look at a tin Coke can, it comes from a big sheet of Coke cans like that. They cut that thing up and make it out. And they would take these sheets of Coke cans and make a wall out of it. So you'd have like a sheet of Pepsi and a sheet of Coke and a sheet of that. And in these little tin huts, you could get a beer, a Vietnamese beer. Ba Mui Ba was the name of the beer, 33, and in Vietnamese. Everybody said it was made with formaldehyde, but we use all sorts of things as preservatives. I don't think formaldehyde is the worst thing I've ever had. And they had these little peanuts that were called dao phum, and so you could sit in there at night with your Vietnamese counterpart and have a beer and eat some of these peanuts and just talk. And there wasn't any electricity; it was all like a little oil lamp or something. And we were way out there, but those were memorable times. Just going out with my counterpart. The Vietnamese officers made probably $50 a month. Or $40 a month. I mean, they made nothing virtually, and they had families, many of them, to take care of. So I would always buy the beer, which was cheap, a dime or a quarter or something like that. So those were good times. Those were memorable times. Vietnamese food was good. They had. It's like an egg roll, but it's unique because it's white. The rice paper they make it out of is white, and they wrap it up and deep fry it. And there's a sauce called nuoc mam, which is a fermented fish sauce. It sounds terrible, but it really tastes good. And so you dip these fried egg rolls in this nuoc mam and have a beer. Those were good memories. I mean, you didn't go to the movies or the mall down there, but it was fun.
Who resupplied you and how often were you resupplied?
It depended. If we were in the field, the advisors had to arrange for the resupply if we were out, because the Vietnamese, of course, didn't have any helicopters. And their idea of resupply was they would dump a 50-pound bag of rice, out of the helicopter. We had our sea rations. But the way we worked it is when you would go in the rice paddies, if they're terraced, they pump the water to the top of the hill, and then they flood that, and then they let the water to the next paddy and flood that, and all the way down. And in between each paddy, they had a little wicker basket. And as we went along, the Vietnamese foraged out there. So they would get crayfish and eels and that kind of stuff. And because I was every officer in the Vietnamese Army had a Batman, had an aide. I don't care if it was, now we think of generals have aides or admirals. Well, if you were a lieutenant, you had an aide in the Vietnamese Army. It's sort of a holdover from the days of the French. And so the Batman's job, the aide's job, was just to forage out there for the officer. So at night we would combine our stuff. So I would give them the sea ration can of pork or ham or something, and they would put it in an ammo can, a 50 caliber ammo can, and cook it, and then they would cook up some rice, and that's what we had. So we shared, and we lived with them, ate with them, fought with them, did everything with them. A good advisory team really got close with its Vietnamese unit, and if the guys on the team weren't a bunch of jerks, if they weren't racist or bigots or that kind of stuff, it worked out really well, and I was fortunate that was the kind of team that I was on. My weapons NCO, big, huge black guy, came to me one day and said, "Lieutenant Hardy, I got to talk to you." He said, "The Vietnamese just told me that if I got wounded, I was too big for them to carry." I said, "You're shitting me." He goes, "No, that's what he said. He said that I am too big, and if we're under fire, if things are desperate, basically, that they might not be able to get me out of there because I'm so big." So I went and talked to my counterpart, my lieutenant, about this. He said, "Yeah," he says, it could happen. He says, I can't promise, what'll happen if things become desperate." So I went back to his NCO and I said, I weigh as much as you do, because I was about 240 back in those days. I was big from lifting, playing football. I said, "Let's make a deal." I said, "If something happens and I'm too badly wounded to move, I want you to promise you'll shoot me." And he looked at me and said, "Seriously?" And I said, "Yeah." He says, "Okay, then you got to promise me you do the same thing." I said, "Okay, I'll only do this if your guts are hanging out, if your legs are off, or if I can't get you back. But I won't leave you behind." He said, "I won't leave you behind either, Lieutenant." I think about that today. Holy shit, making a pact like that with somebody. But where we were, so far away from everything, and there's no help going to come, if we got in trouble. It wasn't like we could call the 2nd or the 17th Cavalry to come in and help us out. We were a Vietnamese unit out there, and the Americans had their own issues, and if something happened, we just, we were sort of on our own. And oddly enough, not him, but another sergeant on an operation got wounded up ahead of us in a firefight, and the Vietnamese said they couldn't get him back. And so part of the reason they couldn't get him back is because he had fallen over the rice paddy dike on the bad guy's side. He was wounded, and his legs were shot up, and they didn't want to go over and get him. So I crawled up there and got him back and dragged him back to safety. But it wasn't the black guy. It was just a white guy. I remember going down a couple of days later to see him in the hospital. We flew down to Cu Chi, which is actually you can go there today if you want to. See the tunnels of Cu Chi. He was at his army hospital there, and I went to see him, and the nurse said to me, "Are you the guy that?" Because we pulled his pants down to dress his legs before we moved him, and I dragged him through. It was a dry season, a lot of brambles, so he had all these scratches on his butt. It wasn't like the 10 bullet holes in his leg that he was complaining about. It was all these bramble things on his butt. But I said, "Yeah, I'm the guy." Yeah, I dragged him through there.
So what was that experience like going out there and getting this guy?
I didn't even think about it at the time. It was part of what I was supposed to do as an officer. You just don't leave people behind. I got the inedible Medal for Valor for doing it, but it doesn't mean a lot. What means a lot is saving him. What's odd is I don't know where he is today. In the advisory world, you don't really have reunions because you had 5 guys that came together for a year and then left. And there was very little contact among the advisory team. There is an advisory team like website now. You can go on that. But the people that are on that website are the people that came after I was there, because as the, I won't say the fighting wound down, but it shifted a lot, you know. But the people that were early in the war, particularly up through and just beyond Tet, they're gone. I've never been able to find one person that I was in Vietnam with. The only guy I can find is Dick Glenn, who's dead. I know where his name is on the wall. And I went to his gravesite in Florence, Alabama. I found his grave last summer and decided I was going to go back. And it's in the family plot in Florence, Alabama, this little town in the middle of nowhere. And I walked all over the cemetery until I found it. And it's moss covered. You know, you look at it, it looks like it's been there since the Civil War. But in that climate in Alabama where, you know, it's hot and humid and stuff, there it was, and it was in a line of these Glenn guys. There was a World War I guy there, a World War II guy there, and then Lieutenant Glenn. So he'd come from a family of people that had fought, you know. And I was glad to go back and see that, finally find his grave. They say you can find anything online. It is true, you can. There was also in that place a Confederate cemetery. Within this big cemetery, there was a spot, I'd never seen one of those before, where the Confederate soldiers are buried.
So other than that one experience, did you experience any other combat?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I did.
Can you tell me about some of those other experiences?
You know, it's not like television, I tell you that. I remember a night when my unit was, we walked everywhere. You know, we didn't have any helicopters. So it was unusual for us to go on an airborne operation or air mobile operation. But there was an outpost, this mobile advisory team that I was on would go spend 60 days, you know, with a Vietnamese unit. And we would bring M16s in, and M60s and 81 millimeter mortars, and we would train them on how to use these. And then we would bring in all this logistical stuff, you know, concertina and millions of sandbags, and we would rebuild their outpost and help them register the mortar and help them interlock their fields of fire, you know, in the outpost and all that kind of stuff, and help them with their communications. And we had built an outpost which is right on the Cambodian border. And today, if you look at a map of Tay Ninh, the city of Tay Ninh, you can see a road that heads southwest out of Tay Ninh and crosses over what's called the Vam Co Dam River and heads right toward the border of Cambodia. And back in the day, there was an outpost built right on the road that had a gate on both sides, because all the produce and pigs and chickens would come in from Cambodia, and they would pay a tax at this outpost, and then they would go another, say, 25 miles to the city of Tay Ninh, where they would sell all this stuff. And so we built this outpost up, and it was an architectural miracle. I mean, it was a great outpost. I mean, this place, you know, I didn't think anybody could ever take this place. It had mines and barbed wire and interlocking fields of fire, and I had a couple NCOs that were really good with me, you know, who did this stuff. We laid this stuff out. The Vietnamese worked like dogs to make this happen. And it wasn't a couple months later that that place got attacked and overrun. They destroyed it. And the next day they wanted a relief column to go down, because I had been there before. I volunteered to go. So I got with a Vietnamese unit that I didn't really know, and we helicoptered down there, and there was a Vietnamese Marine unit that had been moved down there. These are good soldiers. I mean, the Vietnamese Marines. There was an American advisor with them, you know. And so we get down there, and the outpost is destroyed. They used a flamethrower on this thing. They came in and they just burned this, you know, they fried these guys. I mean, the bodies of the soldiers were maybe 18 inches long in the bunker when we got them out. And there were dead people everywhere. Guys with knives stuck in. It was hand-to-hand combat in this place. But there were some survivors. Miraculously enough, we had built a command bunker with thick concrete and a couple of vents, breathing vents, and a steel door. And the commander of that place and maybe half a dozen other guys had locked themselves in there. And once we got some firepower raining down on the place, the North Vietnamese left. And so these guys were in this bunker. And when we got there, they came out, and the commander was the guy I had worked with to build this place, and he was absolutely hysterical, about this thing. And he was hysterical, apologizing to me, for letting this happen, because we had agreed this was a place that nobody was ever going to be able to take, But it's foolish to think that, because you can take any place you want to if you're willing to pay the price. But they had used flamethrowers, and that was unusual for the North Vietnamese Army. It didn't happen very often in Vietnam. And they also, it was the first time they used this 120 millimeter mortar, which was huge. Mm-hmm. And it went straight through the roofs of these bunkers that we had built. We built them for what we thought they had, and those things went through there like those things were paper. I just couldn't believe the destruction of that thing. And so after we kind of got things sorted out in the outpost and got the bodies taken care of and everything, this Marine Lieutenant Captain came over and he said, hey, we ought to, dig in for the night around here. So he assigned my little unit, my company, a little portion of the perimeter, and then the Vietnamese Marines were out there. So the Vietnamese Army don't have entrenching tools. I mean, you never use one of those in the Navy, but you know what it is? You got the concept of entrenching. They didn't have any of those things. So digging in at night, I don't think this Vietnamese unit planned to stay there all night, And I didn't know the officers, and they didn't have any tools to dig in with or anything. So my interpreter, I had a guy named Win Van Ja, who was a great guy. He saved my life 1,000 times. He said, sir, I have a bad feeling about this. He was a lazy guy. He got a shovel from someplace, and he started to dig a hole. And if Nguyen Van Ja was scared, I thought, I ought to be worried about this. So I helped him, and he picked a spot behind a little hut, not a very big hut. And we dug a trench about 6 feet long, about 3 feet wide, and then we took the door off one of these places and put it on top there and left a little place to get in and out. And we hit water. The water table is pretty low. We hit water down there about 3 feet, and Ja kept digging. And so we had maybe 6 inches of water in this thing. It sucked. And we had dirt piled on the top of it. It looked like a grave, from the outside. And the Army has an antenna that you carry with you. It's hollow, like hollow aluminum tubing. Mm-hmm. You can put these sections together, and then there are guy wires. You come down and stake it in the ground, and it has a coax cable that clips up into it and then onto your PRC 25 radio. And we were too far away for any other kind of combo, so I set this thing up about 15 or 20 feet away from where I was and ran the thing down in the hole with me. And I wasn't going to get in that water, so I was sleeping out on my poncho liner at night. And I was laying there looking up at the sky, and I heard boom, 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 boom. And I knew it was a mortar, but we weren't firing them. And then the first round hit, and I went diving back into that hole again. And we underwent this barrage, the likes of which I've never heard of before in Vietnam, because they were firing from Cambodia. We were right on the border, from here to that wall, They were firing over onto us. They had plenty of ammunition. But this outpost there was nothing around it for maybe 1,000 yards in all directions. But under that fire, they moved a huge infantry unit up. We were all hunkered down in our holes, and I was just thinking, if a mortar round comes through that little slot that I used, I'm going to get blown to smithereens. And I was looking up through the hole, and all of a sudden, this fire started up from a million machine guns, and the little wall of the house just exploded right before my eyes. I looked at that, and just a million bullet holes came whooping through that thing. I was like, holy shit. And I didn't know what to think, and there was this noise and screaming and yelling and people running everywhere. And I looked out through my little hole, and the whole North Vietnamese army was streaming by me, by this house, because these little houses were like, like that. We were just behind one, and they just went roaring by me at the night. I was like, God. And then what happened is the Marines were smart enough to size up my unit, and they put their reserve unit behind mine. Okay, so they had their perimeter, and their reserve company was dug in behind mine. So the North Vietnamese, they must have picked us out, as a bunch of ragtag, regional force, popular force guys, and said, that's what we're going to attack. The mistake they made is they ran into the Marines, and they got slaughtered. In the midst of all this, Nguyen Van Gia, my interpreter, says, we've got to get out of here. And I said, where are we going to go? He said, to the outpost, which was about 150, 200 yards away. So under all this fire, we crawl, And I said, Ja, he says, speak Vietnamese. I didn't know any, I mean, he's telling me, don't give us away in the night, speaking English. So I had my weapon, Ja had his weapon, and the radio operator had his weapon. And we got into the outpost, and there, cowering in the outpost, were all the soldiers that I had come down with, who had nothing to dig in with at night. I remember one guy had put a little wall of bricks up. Like he had a little foot-high wall of bricks around him. That was his protection for the night, And I was mad that when they ran away, they didn't take their weapons with them. And so I told them to go around the outpost and look for a weapon. I don't care if it's a stick or a knife. Go in the bunkers and look around for weapons, because I wasn't sure that who was going to win this fight, And I had 3 weapons with me. And so they scurried around and they, found a couple of hand grenades and some other stuff in there. And we just hunkered down in that thing and waited for daylight. And when daylight came, we had won. The North Vietnamese had retreated, and that was quite the fight that night. I didn't do much, but it was fascinating being a witness to that kind of carnage when you're not really in it. My fear was the North Vietnamese were going to come back into this outpost, knowing it was there, maybe taking refuge there or something, and fighting from there. And I was just terrified that, we wouldn't be able to hold them off. We didn't have a lot in the way of firepower, but it worked out pretty well. But we took some horrific casualties. I mean, in the morning, it was probably the most gruesome battle I'd ever been part of. But there was a line of guys, Vietnamese Marines, wounded, lying there waiting to get medically evacuated. I bet there were 50 or 60 of them just, wounded. Guys with head wounds. Now, as a physician, I realized that they were, they had a bad head wound, and they were, having seizures, from that, and just some horrific wounds. But the field from there back to where the North Vietnamese had come from was just littered with bodies, and it's hard to imagine. It's hard to imagine the smell of that. That's the one thing about combat that people don't think about, is how bad dead people smell. I mean, it is unreal. The smell of death, of a human body rotting, is something that you never forget. If you ever get a whiff of it, it's like, holy mackerel. And imagine a lot of them out there. But it's funny telling that story. I haven't thought about that in 50 years. It really doesn't bother me. I guess what bothers me is we sent 200 poorly equipped, South Vietnamese soldiers into that thing. No entrenching tools, shitty weapons, no preparation. They had no more reason to be there than the man in the moon. When I think about Vietnam, more than anything else, it makes me sad, just because of that, of us leaving, leaving the Vietnamese behind, of cutting off their money, of cutting off their supply, of cutting off their weapons. We left them to be slaughtered, essentially. So while, I have to be careful what I say to Vietnam veterans, because most of them were with American units and have a very different perspective on the war than I do. But the part of it that strikes me more than anything else was our abandonment of those people after, you know, guys like me went over and spent, you know, a lot of time with them, and we just pulled out, walked out, and went home. And that's the real tragedy of Vietnam from my perspective.
Did your outlook on life change at all with this experience?
You know, I wasn't aware of it at the time. I think war changes people. I think more than anything else, and it took me becoming a physician to realize this, that I am blunted emotionally.
Mm-hmm.
So while people are wailing about death in a hospital, you know, it never bothered me. When you work in the emergency room and people come in broken up, you know, everybody's all excited, it doesn't bother me. You know, so I have, of anything I can identify from my experience in Vietnam, it is this blunted emotional response to fear, to danger, and to death. Mm-hmm. You know, it doesn't bother me. I'm not afraid of anything. You know, nothing scares me. Even my own death doesn't scare me. Mm-hmm. You know, so I don't know if most Vietnam veterans are, you know, aware of that consciously, or if they are introspective, look at their life and see that. But I know, and it's taken me a long time to realize that, mm-hmm. you know, that's my legacy from that. Because every day I had, as an officer, I had a job to do. You know, I had people to take care of. You know, I didn't want anybody to get killed, and if they were wounded, I had to take care of them, and I had to make sure that we got things done. And you know, it was just this responsibility. You know, for a 23-year-old guy, mm-hmm. it sort of sets a tone that you carry, you know, for the rest of your life. And it's funny, I'm the interim director at the VA right now, and people ask me about this, and it's not a big deal because I just seem to have been in leadership positions all my life since, you know, that day I reported into the 101st Airborne Division at 21. I've never seen myself as a leader. You know, I don't see myself as that kind of a person. It just sort of happened, and I think that if I've been successful at all, it's because that I, one, have been lucky. Two, if you care about the people that work for you, no matter how dangerous the job is, you know, it makes the situation better, you know, for everybody. So if anything, the only thing I can really put my finger on from Vietnam is just that blunted emotional response to stuff.
How long were you over there?
18 months.
18 months. Did you form any special relationships with any of your Vietnamese counterparts or other American soldiers?
Yeah, very, very much so. Another thing I think I feel badly about now is that when the thing was falling apart in the 70s, you know, 73, 74, 75, I didn't have the financial wherewithal to, you know, bring anybody back, or, you know, I was living in somebody's basement working for $400 a month. You know, I mean, I was trying to figure out what I was going to do with my life then. I wasn't in a position to help anybody. And I didn't think much about it at the time. I didn't think about my advisor, you know, Ja, or the officers that I was with, you know, and I'm not sure that saving them or, you know, finding a church that would sponsor them or something, none of that occurred to me at, you know, at the time. But when I went home after my first year, I extended, you know, to stay over there for another 18 months. And I was miserable for that month back home. When I came back to Pennsylvania, I was miserable. Oh, God, it was terrible. You know, nothing to do. People wouldn't have anything to do with you. You couldn't get a date, you know. No one would go out with you. I mean, it sucked. And I couldn't wait to get back to Vietnam. And when I got back, my Vietnamese unit had a party for me, you know, welcomed me back. I brought some stuff back from America. It was like coming home again. It was such an odd experience to feel so alienated from here, you know, and feel so welcomed, you know, back there. Yeah, I was pretty tight with the Vietnamese. I took good care of them, you know. As an American, You know, cultural sensitivity is a relatively new term, new idea. But I think even before other than taking the bath in front of everybody with no clothes on, I had a cultural sensitivity I never realized, and it probably is just you know, part of who I am. But I really like them. I like their culture. I thought their history was amazing. You know, their ability to survive in the midst of that war, even to this day, fascinates me. How they could carry on, you know, a semi-normal life in the midst of all that, particularly with a bunch of, you know, 500,000 crazy Americans over there, who frankly had no respect for anybody that wasn't an American. Part of an advisor's job was to make what is called a solatium payment, and solus, which comes from Latin, you know, really means I'm sorry. You know, if you provide solace to somebody, you comfort them. And so these solatium payments were ones, we still make them today. So if you shoot an Afghan or an Iraqi, or maybe their sacred cow or pig or something, there's a system for remuneration. You know, we pay them for that. And we had the same thing in Vietnam. There was a scale on which we paid them. So a father was worth, say, 500 piastres, and a mother 400, and a kid 300, and a water buffalo 200, and a pig 100, and a chicken 50. And I mean, yeah, that's how we paid them. So if we killed somebody accidentally, the advisor, me, had to go down to the village where we had just killed this person and offer them, you know, 500 piastres for their dad, and, you know, an apology from the United States government. Even though I didn't do it, the American unit did it. But they just went ripping through, ran over them with an armored personnel carrier, you know, who knows what the hell they did. Shot them, shot the water buffalo. I mean, water buffalo was like deer hunting, you know, for a lot of these, you know, fellers from West Virginia. Bet you can't hit that thing out there, but I can. And next thing you know, you drop this water buffalo, which is, you know, it's the family fortune. You know, it's like we own a house here and a car, you know, they have a water buffalo. So it really, I won't say soured me on America, but it gave me a view of American culture in relationship to the rest of the world, which still exists today. I mean, this arrogance that we carried to Vietnam, we've carried it to Iraq, we've carried it to Afghanistan, and part of the reason things don't work out very well for us over there is just how we approach these problems. To think that if you show up with the Marines, people are going to say, okay, you win. You know, we sort of lost that, and I think the start of that really was there in Vietnam.
Can you tell me what some of those interactions were like when you made these payments?
It was awful. You know, sometimes they'd throw the money on the ground. I hated doing it. It was just such a trite, meaningless gesture. And have a table, you know, calculate the value of a human life as 500 piastres for a dad and 400 for mom. You know, it's just like, you know, it didn't sit well with me then, and I was too young to really realize what was going on. But we're not a lot different today, you know, in many respects. We still treat the rest of the world, in many cases, like second-class citizens, particularly if they're not, you know, the same color as us. You know?
So, how long total did you spend in Vietnam?
I was there 18 months.
18 months. And you said that you went back home for a little bit in between the time?
They gave you 30 days leave in between your first year and your second tour. So I took advantage of that. I should have gone to Australia or, you know, done something else, but, you know, I wanted to get back and reassure my mother that I was in one piece and all that. I mean, she was glad to see me. She fed me and all this kind of stuff, but I just moped around, you know, for a month.
What was the reception like when you came home?
It sucked. You know, all these stories you hear about San Francisco, every one of those is true. Because when we landed there, there were these protesters everywhere, you know, throwing shit and spitting on us, and oh my God, it sucked. It was just, it was an eye-opening experience, I gotta tell you, to come back to that. Yeah, it was.
How long did you? Go ahead.
It was like a movie. You know, you see movies with that stuff in it, but to be a part of it, yeah.
How long did it take to kind of feel normal, or did it ever feel normal?
I never felt abnormal. You know, today is a great day to be a vet. These days, those days were not great days to be a vet, and you were better off not telling people that you'd been to Vietnam. And so I never did. I mean, I wasn't ashamed of what I had done. I was more ashamed of what we had done, you know, as a country. But once again, my experience as an advisor is so different than the vast majority of Vietnam vets. I'm sort of an odd duck in all this thing. You know, I came back in 1969. I spent 2 more years in the Army. You know, I was a garrison commander of a unit, you know, making sure the grass got cut and the rocks were painted white everywhere. And then I got out, and while I was in Vietnam, I decided I want to go to medical school, because we did these things called medical civic action programs. They still do them today. You come into a village someplace and bring a doctor or dentist or something, and they have sick call, basically, for the village. And my job was to take my unit and clear the village first to make sure it was safe. And so we would clear the village, and then we'd set up a landing zone. They'd bring the helicopter in, the doc or the dentist would get off, and then I'd go in and watch what they did. And I was standing there one day watching this dentist pull teeth. I mean, there was a line like a football field long of people waiting to get their teeth pulled. And he had a syringe, I'll never forget it, had the ring on the thing like they have today. And he would just numb them up and pull that tooth out and put a piece of gauze in there and give them a little paper packet of Motrin or something, you know, and send them on their way. And they were so appreciative of that, I couldn't believe it. And I've been there for more than a year, and I thought that I was a pretty good advisor. You know, I thought I was doing the right thing, building those impregnable outposts and all that kind of crazy stuff. And I thought, in one afternoon, this guy has done more good than I've done in a year. I said, I got this thing wrong somehow. And that's when I started thinking about medicine. And, you know, 2.3 grade average, you ain't going to go to medical school. But that gave me the motivation when I came back to go back to school again. I was a history major with a theology minor. I was going to be a Lutheran minister. That was really why I went to college. And so I didn't have any science or math courses, so I had to go back and spend 2 years doing all that chemistry stuff. And then I finally got into medical school. It took a couple tries. When I first went to the Hershey Medical School, which is Penn State's medical school, I bought a new suit. I show up, I get everything, I give it to the lady, and she looks at it, and then she looks at me and closes the folder up, which is a bad sign, and slides it back across and said, have you read our book? I said, yeah. She goes, well, you see, you can't matriculate here if you're over 25. So this was 1973. I said, I was 28, so I was 3 years too old to start. It's impossible today to think about that. You know, there was an age limit to enter medical school. And I said, you know, ma'am, there's a war going on. I couldn't get here any sooner. She goes, I'm sorry, Mr. Hardy. And so I got up and left. And I thought that was it until I met a guy who was an Army doc. And he was a DO. I don't know if you know the difference between osteopathic physicians and allopathic. He was a DO. And he said, I don't think there are any age limits at my school. So I went out and interviewed, and I got in, and the rest is history.
So then you went back into the Army as a doctor?
Yeah, and when I went to medical school, I had a chance to get a scholarship, you know, like an Army scholarship. I didn't want anything to do with the Army. I pretty much had it with them. And when I was getting ready to graduate, I didn't have an internship spot picked out. And a friend of mine said he was going to Portsmouth in the Navy, and they were paying twice as much as a civilian internship. This was 1980. They were paying $35,000 a year, which in those days was a lot of money. And he said, you see if you can get an Army internship. I said, God, I don't want to go back in the Army again. But $35,000, man, that's a lot of money, particularly after 4 years of not making any. You know? So I called Washington, and lo and behold, they had one spot left in the entire U.S. Army. It was in psychiatry at Fort Gordon, Georgia. And I said, I'll take it. I didn't want to be a psychiatrist, but I took it. And so I did a year of psychiatry, and then I flipped over into family medicine. But just, once again, just luck, you know, just get the last spot in the Army to be a doctor.
And how much longer did you spend in the Army?
I had a total of 22 years. So I had 5 as an infantry officer and then 17 or so as a doc.
So where were the places you were stationed after that?
When I was a third-year resident, they come around and ask you where you want to go. And as a second-year resident, I had gone to Germany on this thing called Reforger, the Return of Forces to Germany. They had this big thing on the board, and it said they're looking for a physician to go to Germany. So I went down and talked to my chief and volunteered, and he says, no, Tom, he says, they need a real doctor. You're just a resident. I said, all right, sir. So there were 350 docs in this hospital, and they couldn't get one of them to volunteer for this thing. So he came back to me and asked me if I was still interested. I said, yeah, sir. He says, well, I think we can make this a military medicine rotation for you. I said, it's fine, sir. So I went to Benning. We flew over to Germany and spent 6 weeks over there. It was a great experience. We had a combat support hospital, you know, set up. You know, we got to do, I mean, I think they had maybe 7 people died that year in Reforger. You know, we have 50,000 guys driving around tanks and stuff. I mean, people are going to get hurt. But it was a great experience. And so when I got to be a third-year resident, I told the recruiter I wanted to go back to Germany, and I wanted to be in charge of something. So they made me a clinic commander, a big clinic in Nuremberg. And it was a great, best assignment, best job I ever had in my life. Because when I got there, you always want to follow somebody who's been relieved, you know, or got fired or something, you know. So the commander before me had been fired. And so the only way to go is up when I got there. And it was a ragtag unit. And I had a formation outside. I had the docs and all the enlisted people in a formation. They'd never been in a formation since basic training. I lined them all up, open ranks, and we went down and inspected everybody. And a couple people passed. And so I said, we're going to do this every Thursday afternoon until there's only one guy left out here. And I had one doctor, it was pathetic, and I said, I think I knew who that one guy's going to be. And everybody started laughing because they knew it was going to be him too. But it really squared the unit away. You know, it became a disciplined unit, and we did really, really well. And I'm still in touch with a lot of those people. You know, that's 30 years ago. That was a great assignment. We took good care of people.
What was after that?
I became the division surgeon of the 1st Armored Division, Old Ironsides. That's a great job. You know, it was a real job because in those days, you know, we were looking at the Russians across the border there, and so you know, readiness mission, training, training medics. It was a lot of fun. You know, getting medics ready to go out and actually, and having been in combat, and having taken care of people who are wounded in combat, and knowing how important that job is. I was pretty credible when I would teach, you know, these classes, starting IVs and all this kind of stuff, how important it was, you know, and that was a great job. And I came back here and, you know, had a couple other assignments. I eventually went to the Army War College, which is a big deal for a doc. I think there were 4 of us that year that got picked to go out of a class of 300 guys, and everybody else were war fighters, you know, pilots and submarine commanders, and, you know, and it's pretty cool because there are Foreign Service people there, State Department, CIA, Secret Service. It's a mix of senior leaders from the government, all mixed together in this group. And you're in these 16-person seminars for a year, and there's one of each. So there's one Army, one Navy, one Marine Corps, one Foreign Service. We had a foreign officer, we had an Australian guy. And you talk about the basis of power in the world and how it's not about war, but it's more about power, education, social structure of countries around the world. And that was 94, 95. And even then, China was on the radar for us, even as far back as that. And then I got out. I commanded a hospital, Fort Riley, Kansas. I was hospital commander there for 3 years, and then got out and got the shock of my life when I realized what medicine was like in the civilian world. You know, practicing in the Army, the military, where money isn't an issue. You know, when you come out to it's a business. You know, I'm not being pejorative. It's just that's the way it is. Hospitals and physicians are out there to make money. And it took me a long time to realize that.
You kind of touched on it before, but did the younger guys look up to you, being a combat veteran in Vietnam? Was there a dynamic that they looked for in you as leadership or mentoring?
You know, I don't think that most people, particularly these days, think much about that. You know, I mean, I'm like a Civil War veteran, you know, honestly. My combat experience, you know, 50 years ago, doesn't count for much anymore. I'm a relic. The only thing I have going for me is that experience, you know, the leadership experience of over 50 years. And that's why I think we're doing well at the VA, is just, you know, having dealt with a lot of things in my life. I can mentor people. I can have them look at both sides of an issue, you know, to always assume good intent. You know, there's some things that really have helped us along to take care of veterans out there.
What led to your work with the VA?
The Kettering Health Network got in a pickle financially, and they let a bunch of us senior leaders go. There were 2 senior physicians, myself and an MD, and both of us got our severance papers. And I went out to the VA just to be a doc, and I just wanted to go out and be a family practice doc. And the chief of staff position was open. I don't know, you haven't been here very long, but around 2010 they had a bit of an issue out there with a dentist that was using the same tools again and again on people, not washing them off. And you know, the director got fired, and the chief of staff got fired, and everybody got fired. So I got there just, you know, as their taillights were, you know, kind of going down over the hill. So once again, you want to follow somebody, that's their job, you know, because you can always do a good job after that. And so they asked me if I wanted to be the chief of staff, and I said sure. So,
what's that experience been like working with veterans?
I love it. It really has been. I never was comfortable in the private sector. You know, I got out in 1998, and until I came back to the VA in 2012, I was never comfortable out there in the private world. I mean, I'm really, and I hate to admit it, but I'm a soldier at heart. I mean, it's not something that I ever thought about until I came back out there, where there's some structure, where you're around veterans, where you have some commonality with people that doesn't exist on the outside. And I realized that part of my discomfort with the civilian world is the few veterans that I would meet out there, you know, have a shared experience with. You know, I don't have much to say for these Air Force guys. You know, I mean, we don't have a shared experience. Really, it's true. I mean, the organization is different. You know, whether it's a squadron or a flight or a group. You know, I don't know how that translates into a battalion or a brigade or a division. So they tell me that they were a group commander. I don't know if it's like a Boy Scout troop or if it's like some big organization. But when I meet somebody in the Army, you know, we speak the same language. You know, we have a frame of reference that makes the conversation more comfortable. So I've really enjoyed going out there and just going to the lobby and seeing these guys with these patches on. I recognize them all, so I'll talk to them. And they're all surprised to find out that the chief of staff, you know, has a combat infantryman's badge and a ranger tab and all that stuff. It's fun just to, you know, kid them about stuff. And I've established some really good working relationships out there with the vets.
Awesome. We're just wrapping up here. Do you have any questions?
No, you've done a good job covering it.
So what message would you like to leave for future generations that might be viewing this interview?
Well, if they're veterans, there's not much I can say that's going to change that. If they're people who have never served, I guess if they can take anything away from this story or from the stories of other veterans, it's that there is a really small group of Americans, right now about 1%, who have stepped forward to serve their country. And you need to appreciate what they do. Even if you don't agree with the policy or the war, don't take it out on the person who has been trying to do that. We signed up to serve, and we'll go where our country sends us. And I just ask that you honor their service.
Well, that's about all the time we have. Dr. Hardy, thank you so much.
My
Thanks for
pleasure.
being here, and thank you for your service. Really appreciate it.
Here's to. I just want to go down the Suez in that sub, man. That just still sounds too cool.
That concludes the interview of Dr. Tom Hardy.